When billionaire Michael unexpectedly invited humble waitress Lisa to his lavish wedding, no one could have predicted that her presence would turn everything upside down. Dive into a story about how a single sincere act can change destinies and find true love in the most unexpected circumstances. I kindly ask you to listen until the end, give a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel, as your attention helps the channel grow and allows me to create new and interesting stories. Thank you. Billionaire Michael was known for his wealth and eccentricity. He threw the most lavish parties in town, and his wedding was set to be the event of the year. Hundreds of guests received invitations. Among them were well-known politicians, actors, and businessmen. But one invitation turned out to be unusual. Michael sent it to a simple waitress from the restaurant where he sometimes dined. Her name was Lisa. Lisa couldn't believe her eyes when she saw the envelope with her name on it. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't famous, and she didn't even know Michael personally, but the invitation was real. Her colleagues laughed, saying it must be some kind of mistake, but Lisa decided to go anyway. She borrowed a dress from her neighbor and did a simple hairstyle. When she entered the hall, everyone froze. Her appearance was a complete surprise. Guests whispered amongst themselves, "Why is she here? Who is she?" Michael was standing at the altar, smiling. He saw Lisa and immediately walked towards her. Guests watched every step he took with astonishment, but no one could predict what would happen next. Michael approached Lisa and extended his hand to her. His voice was quiet but confident. "I'm glad you came," he said. Lisa was bewildered, but managed to nod in response. The guests looked at them in confusion, and the bride at the altar appeared stunned. "Who is she?" she finally asked, unable to hide her irritation. Michael looked at the bride and calmly said, "Lisa means more to me than you can imagine." The hall filled with hums and whispers. People tried to understand what was happening. Lisa still couldn't believe what was going on. She quietly said, "I'm just a waitress. I don't understand why I'm here." Michael smiled and replied, "Sometimes the simplest people have the greatest hearts." Guests froze in anticipation, some trying to ask Michael what he meant, but he just took Lisa's hand and led her to the altar. The music stopped, and all eyes were on them. Lisa felt her heart pounding fiercely. She whispered, "Why are you doing this?" Michael replied, "You saved me when I didn't even know I needed saving." Lisa frowned, trying to remember, and suddenly a scene from the past flashed before her eyes. She remembered the day Michael came to the restaurant late in the evening. He looked dejected. She handed him a cup of tea and simply said, "Everything will be all right." Those words meant more to him than anything else in the world. Now she stood before him, not knowing what to say. Guests continued whispering, each trying to guess what would happen next. Lisa looked at Michael with surprise. She hadn't thought her simple words could have such a profound effect on someone. Her voice trembled as she finally spoke. "I didn't know it was so important to you." Michael looked at her gently and said, "Sometimes the simplest things change lives." At that moment, silence settled over the hall. Guests stopped whispering, waiting to see what would happen next. The bride took a step forward, her face flushed with anger. "Are you going to explain what's going on?" she said. Michael turned to her. His voice was firm but calm. "I realized I can't marry you. I realized you are not the person who will stand by me when life gets tough." Guests gasped. Some couldn't believe their ears. Lisa wanted to leave. She felt out of place, but Michael held her hand tighter. "Please don't go," he said quietly. His words made her pause. At that moment she realized he was sincere. He truly valued her. Guests began exchanging glances. Some started applauding. Someone whispered, "This is the strangest moment I've ever seen." But no one left the hall. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Lisa took a deep breath and looked Michael in the eye. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I don't know what to say." Michael smiled and replied, Just be yourself. That's enough. Those words surprised her. She stood still, feeling something change inside her. Movement began in the hall. People started coming closer, each wanting to hear their conversation and understand what would happen next. Lisa felt dozens of eyes on her. Her heart raced as never before. She didn't know what to do, but she understood that now everything had changed. Michael, holding her hand, was confident and calm. His eyes radiated warmth. He turned to the guests and loudly said, "Today, I realize that happiness is not in luxury, not in status, and not in superficial beauty. Happiness is in sincerity, kindness, and in those people who see the real you." Guests started whispering again. Some nodded approvingly, some looked baffled. The bride in the white dress stood motionless, her face frozen. "You can't do this to me," she finally said. Her voice was full of anger and pain. Michael looked at her calmly. "I don't want to build a life on deception," he said, "and I can't be with someone who only sees money in me." Those words resonated through the hall. Lisa lowered her eyes. She didn't want to feel like the cause of this conflict, but Michael looked at her tenderly. "You saved me," he said, "and I want you to know your kindness changed my life." Those words brought tears to her eyes. She felt warmth fill her chest, but she still didn't understand why he was doing this. Guests began to slowly approach closer. Some filmed everything on their phones. Others watched with admiration. Some clearly disapproved. Lisa quietly said, "I don't know what to do next." Michael smiled. "We'll figure it out together." His confidence gave her strength. She raised her eyes, looked at the crowd, and felt her fears begin to fade. She didn't yet know where this day would lead her, but she felt that this moment would change everything in her life. The crowd stood in tense anticipation. Someone whispered, someone exchanged glances. "Did you stage this spectacle to humiliate me?" the bride shouted. Her voice rang with fury, but Michael didn't look at her. His attention was fixed only on Lisa. Lisa felt that everyone awaited her reaction. Her heart stood still, and she took a deep breath. "I don't know why I'm here," she began quietly. "But if I really helped you, then I'm glad." Her voice trembled but sounded sincere. Guests held their breath. "Lisa, you've done more for me than anyone else. Your sincerity gave me the strength to understand who I am," Michael said. He turned to the crowd and loudly added, "I want each of you to see that happiness is not in status, but in honesty." Guests began to slowly applaud. Some nodded, some still looked shocked. Lisa felt her eyes fill with tears. She stood there, at the center of attention, and felt that the whole world had changed, but she still didn't know what would happen next. Her voice came out unexpectedly confident. "Thank you for your words, Michael. I don't know what I can give you in return." He smiled lightly and quietly replied, "Your honesty is already more than enough." The crowd continued to watch them. Everyone in the hall understood that they were witnessing something unusual. But what would happen next, no one could predict. Lisa stood motionless. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to comprehend what she had just heard. The guests surrounded them closer, many filming the event on their phones. Some looked confused. Someone whispered that they had never seen anything like it. Michael still held her hand. His voice was soft, but carried so everyone in the hall could hear it. "Lisa, don't be afraid. You're stronger than you think." She looked at him. Her eyes gleamed. "Why did you choose me?" Her voice was quiet, but the words were clear. Michael smiled. "You were the only person who saw me as I am, without all this entourage, without the status and money, just a person." Lisa felt her heart clench. She never thought her small act would leave such an impact. Meanwhile, the bride stood aside. Her face expressed a mix of anger and humiliation. Her voice sounded again, "You can't just leave me like this." Michael looked at her calmly. "I'm not leaving you. I just can't deceive myself any longer." His words hung in the air. The guests froze, silence enveloping the hall. Lisa realized that she could no longer stay on the sidelines. She took a deep breath and turned to Michael. "I never sought this. I never thought I would become part of something like this, but if you see value in me, then I'm ready to be by your side." Her voice was firm and sincere. Michael nodded slightly, his face lighting up with a smile. At that moment, the crowd erupted in applause. Someone shouted words of approval, others still appeared shocked, but confidence was read in their eyes. This story was only beginning. Lisa felt exciting warmth spreading within. She looked at Michael and realized that before her was a person who truly saw her. The crowd around them didn't quiet down. Someone tried to get closer to catch every word. The bride still stood aside. Her gaze was full of rage, but now her anger no longer interested anyone. Michael took Lisa's hand and raised it so that everyone could see. "I want each of you to know," he said loudly, "this woman reminded me what it means to live truly. Her simple words became more important to me than all the riches in the world." These words created a new buzz in the hall. People paid attention, applauded, and others filmed it on their phones. Lisa felt her knees give way, but Michael held her firmly, not letting her fall. She quietly told him, "I still don't understand why you need me. You can choose anyone." Michael smiled, his voice almost a whisper, but she heard every word. "You're the only one who did something for me selflessly. That is worth more than anything else." The crowd stood still. Each of his words seemed to echo through the hall. Lisa felt tears well up in her eyes. She looked at Michael, and in that moment someone from the guests shouted, "This needs to be celebrated." These words brought laughter and applause. Guests began to smile. Many seemed inspired, even those who continued to watch with skepticism. Lisa felt Michael squeeze her hand even tighter. He leaned toward her and quietly said, "Are you ready for a new chapter?" Her voice was a bit uncertain, but she nodded. "Yes, I am ready." Around them, emotions continued to swirl, but for the two of them, this was only the beginning, the start of something big and completely new. Michael smiled, hearing her words, his gaze growing even warmer. He raised his hand, inviting all the guests to quiet down. Silence spread through the hall. Everyone waited to hear what he would say next. "Today should have been a celebration," he said, "and I want it to remain so. But now it will be a celebration not just for me. It will be a day where I thank the person who showed me what it means to be genuine." Guests whispered again. Some smiled, some looked puzzled. The bride suddenly lifted her head. Her voice was sharp. "Are you really going to leave me for her?" Michael turned to her, his gaze firm but calm. "I'm not leaving you. I'm just choosing the truth over lies." His words hung in the air. Lisa felt her heart beat faster. She wanted to say something but didn't know what. Michael addressed the guests once more. "This day should be the start of something new, and I want you to witness it." He looked at Lisa. His eyes shone with confidence. "Are you ready to share this day with me?" Her voice was quiet but firm. "If you are sure, then I am ready." Guests began to applaud. Someone shouted words of support. The bride turned sharply and quickly left the hall. No one stopped her. All eyes were fixed on Michael and Lisa. He stepped closer, his voice almost a whisper. "You can't imagine how much you've changed my life." These words made her smile. The crowd around them came alive, music played again, someone raised a glass of champagne. But for Lisa, it all felt like a dream. She stood next to Michael, feeling that this day changed not only his life, but her own as well. Lisa looked at Michael, her thoughts swirling like a whirlwind. She couldn't believe she was standing there, among the crowd, surrounded by strangers. But at that moment, everything around seemed unimportant. She saw only his confident, kind eyes. Guests began to raise their glasses. Some smiled. Others still tried to grasp what was happening. Michael turned to the crowd. "I want to thank everyone who came today. I understand, for many of you all this seems unexpected. But sometimes life throws us surprises, and this day has been the biggest surprise for me." His voice was confident and warm. These words brought applause. Lisa felt a bit awkward, her face slightly flushed. She quietly said, "I don't know what to do with all this attention." Michael leaned toward her, his voice almost a whisper. "Just be yourself. That's enough." Her heart beat faster again, but next to him, she felt a strange calm. The music played louder, and someone among the guests suggested the first dance. Michael's eyes lit up. He offered Lisa his hand. "Will you dance with me?" Her voice trembled, but she nodded. "I'll try." Guests moved aside, making space. Michael took her hand and led her to the center of the hall. Lisa felt the gaze of dozens of eyes on her, but his confidence helped her stay steady. They began to move with the music. Her steps were a bit awkward, but Michael supported her. At that moment, it seemed the whole world disappeared, leaving just the two of them. The guests' whispers gradually faded as people watched two completely different people find something in common. Someone quietly said, "This is a true fairy tale." These words resonated with Lisa's soul, but she knew it wasn't a fairy tale. It was her new reality. The dance continued, and each step felt like a step into a new life for her. The music quieted, guests still murmuring, whispering about what had just transpired. Lisa stood next to Michael, her trembling hand still in his. Her heart swelled with excitement, but a warm feeling spread inside her, one she couldn't quite explain. Michael turned to the altar, to the priest who was watching the scene unfold with interest and a gentle smile. His voice broke the established silence. "Today, I was going to say words that had meaning for me, but I realized that true meaning lies elsewhere. I was blind, chasing an illusion, but now I see clearly. And in front of me is the person who showed me what it means to live, love, and be real." Lisa held her breath as Michael knelt before her, right in the center of the lavishly decorated hall. Hundreds of eyes were glued to the scene, but Lisa saw only his serious, tender gaze. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a simple yet sophisticated ring. "Lisa," he began, his voice firm but warm, "you changed my life with just one word. You showed me that nothing is valuable without sincerity, warmth, and kindness. So, I want to ask you, will you make me the happiest man in the world? Will you walk through life with me, not as a part of a spectacle, not as a guest, but as my wife?" Her eyes filled with tears. The hall, full of guests, seemed to disappear. She saw only him. All thoughts, all doubts suddenly vanished. Lisa nodded, her voice trembling but confident. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." The crowd gasped and then burst into applause. Someone shouted words of approval, others wiped away tears. Michael rose, placing the ring on her finger, and embraced Lisa. Her heart pounded like never before, but she felt happy. The whole world suddenly came together at that moment, here and now. Michael turned to the priest. "I realize the planned ceremony was founded on a lie, and that was my mistake. But I want this day to still be a day of new family. We are ready to get married right here and right now if it's possible." The priest smiled in amazement, but he seemed ready to improvise. "Well, this is rather unusual, but we have everything we need. If you are certain, Michael, and if Lisa agrees." Lisa looked up at Michael, and despite her shyness, smiled and nodded. "Yes, I agree," she answered firmly. The ceremony began at once. The guests, still stunned by what was happening, immediately fell silent and focused on the priest, who began reciting the familiar words. The bride, who had previously stood at the altar, had disappeared from the hall, but no one paid attention to it. All eyes were on Michael and Lisa. During the exchange of vows, Michael spoke, looking into Lisa's eyes. "I promise to love you for who you are, for your kind heart, your honesty, and for reminding me who I can be. With you, I've found myself, and I promise never to forget that." Lisa gazed back at him, her voice trembling with overwhelming emotion. "You saw me where I thought I was invisible to myself. I don't know where this path will lead us, but I promise to be by your side, no matter how our life turns out. You made me feel needed, and I will always be grateful for that." When the priest pronounced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride," the hall erupted in loud applause, cheers, and whistles. Michael gently leaned into Lisa, and their kiss was filled with everything they felt for each other: gratitude, tenderness, and hope. For all the guests, it was a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. And for Lisa and Michael, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where love found them in the most unexpected circumstances. The evening transitioned into an impromptu banquet, and the guests, full of skepticism just an hour ago, now smiled and congratulated the newlyweds. Lisa was swept up in a whirlwind of congratulations, support, and joy. Never before had there been so much warmth in her life, and she knew it was only the beginning. Michael held her hand, and any uncertainty or doubt vanished. His face beamed with a smile, and his eyes sparkled with true happiness. "You will change my world," he whispered to her. Lisa, smiling, responded, "We will change it together, Michael." And although their lives had been so different until recently, they were now part of one whole. Their union was built not on status, money, or expectations, but on the strongest foundation of all: sincerity and trust. Did you enjoy this story? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to not miss new releases. See you soon.